Hello everyone, my name is TUMNAD, and in today's video we are looking at what we call the gastric secretion. If you find it helpful at the end of it all, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and then subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, in this video, we are going to be focusing on what we call gastric secretion. We shall follow these kind of the objectives. We shall look at what we call the overview of the gastric secretion. We look at what we call the components of the gastric secretion. We look at what we call the phases of gastric secretion, and finally look at what we call some of those cells which are involved in this production of these different gastric secretions. Okay. Now, first thing first, we need to understand what is gastric secretion. Now, gastric secretion, these are going to be the secretions which are going to be produced by what we call the stomachal walls. Okay, because we have what we call the gastric glands that are going to be responsible for production of what we call the gastric secretions. Okay. Now, gastric secretions is going to be happening in three phases. Okay, it's going to be happening in three phases. The first phase is going to be what we call cephalic. Okay, the first phase is what we call the cephalic phase. Okay, what we call the cephalic phase. The second one is what we call the gastric phase. Okay, the second one is what we call the gastric phase. And then the last one is what we call the intestinal. Okay, what we call the intestinal phase. Meaning that we are going to be having gastric secretions being produced in three phases: cephalic, gastric, and even also what we call the intestinal phase. Okay. Now, we need to first understand, we are talking of gastric secretions. What are those components of what we call the gastric secretion? So the following are the components of what we call gastric secretions. Okay. The first one, which is super very important, is what we call the hydrochloric acid. Okay, hydrochloric acid. And then the second one is what we call the intrinsic factor. Okay, the third one is what we call pepsin. Okay, the third one is what we call pepsin. The first one is what we call the gastric lipase. Okay, the gastric lipase. And then another one which is super very important is also that we also have what we call the mucus. Okay, what we call the mucus. So now there could be other kind of the substances which are going to be part of the gastric secretions, but these ones are super very important. We also have a lot of the electrolytes, but here we are going to be mainly focusing on what we call the bicarbonate. Okay, super very important. So now, having seen the components of the gastric secretions, let's go ahead and look what are some of those cells that are going to be responsible for the production of this kind of what we call the gastric secretions, because it is worth to be known. By the time we tackle these kind of these phases with the gastric secretions, we need to be now knowing all these cells that we are going to be playing with. Okay. Now, some of these cells which are involved in the secretion of the gastric secretions, we have the first one, which is super very important, is what we call the parietal cell. Okay, so now we are going to be talking about this parietal cell time and again. Okay, and this cell is super very important in production of what we call hydrochloric acid. Okay, and even also is super very important in production of what we call the intrinsic factor. Okay, the intrinsic factor. So now when we talk of the parietal cells, it is producing what we call the hydrochloric acid and even also the intrinsic factor. Another cell is what we call the chief cell. Okay, what we call the chief cells. Okay, and these chief cells are super very important in production of what we call pepsinogen. Okay, they produce a molecule called pepsinogen. But this pepsinogen, under the influence of hydrochloric acid, it gets converted into an active form which we call the pepsin. Okay, so now the influence is going to be by what we call HCl that converts pepsinogen into pepsin. That starts the breakdown of what we call the proteins. Okay. Another molecule produced by the chief cell is what we call the gastric lipase. Okay, and this gastric lipase aids in the chemical digestion of what we call the fats. Okay, and then another super very important type of the cell, these are what we call the mucus. Okay, what we call the mucus cells. And these mucus cells, we have two types of these kind of the mucus cells. The first one is what we call the foveola, and then another one is what we call the mucus neck, the mucus neck cells. Okay, these cells are super very important in production of what we call mucus. Okay, so now mainly these are going to be the cells which are involved in secretion of what we call the gastric secretions. Besides that, we also have some other cells which we call the enteroendocrine cells that are super very important in producing different molecules that go ahead and stimulate these cells. We need to take attention on some of these enteroendocrine cells because they stimulate these cells to produce their secretions. Okay? The most important ones here, which I want to pay much attention, is what we call the G cells. Okay? These G cells are super very important, and they release a hormone which we call gastric. Okay, these cells are going to be producing a hormone called the gastric, and of which this gastric has the ability to stimulate the parietal cells and the chief cells to produce their own secretions. Super very important. Okay. Another kind of the cell which is under enteroendocrine cell is what we call the D cells. Okay, and these D cells, they produce a molecule called somatostatin. Okay, which we call somatostatin. Okay, and this somatostatin can inhibit the G cells from producing gastrin, and by doing that, it is regulating the production of what we call hydrochloric acid. So now somatostatin is a powerful inhibitor for production of what we call hydrochloric acid. Okay, then another cell which is very important is what we call the enterochromaffin-like cells. These cells are super very important in production of a molecule called histamine. Okay, histamine, and of which histamine has the ability to stimulate what we call the parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. Such another beautiful thing. Okay. Then we also have another kind of the cell. These cells are going super very much concentrated in what we call the stomach. Okay. Another cell is what we call enterochromaffin. Okay, enterochromaffin cells. Okay, and these cells are super very important in producing a molecule called serotonin. Okay, and of which serotonin is super very important in regulating what we call the gut motility. Okay. Then we also have some other cells that we are going to be talking much about them during the intestinal phase of gastric secretion. They are going to be super much residing in what we call the intestines, particularly what we call the duodenum. Okay, the first one, which is super very important, is what we call the eye cell. Okay, what we call the eye cell. This cell is super very important, and this cell releases molecule which you call cholecystokinin. Okay, they release a molecule called cholecystokinin. Super very important. Okay, then we also have some other cells which we call the S cell. This cell is just called the S cells. And these cells, they produce a molecule called secretin. So again, see during the intestinal phase of gastric secretion, what secretin does. Okay. Besides that, we also have some other cell, and this cell is what we call the K cell. Okay, what we call the K cell, and these cells are super very important in production of a molecule called gastric inhibitory peptide. Okay. What we call gastric inhibitory peptide, which is super powerful inhibitor of gastric secretions. Besides that, this molecule can go to the islets of the Langerhans and stimulate the beta cell of the islets of the Langerhans to produce what we call insulin. Okay, it also such another beautiful thing. Okay, then besides that, we also have some kind of the intestinal G cells. Okay, we have what we call other cells like intestinal G cells that are also going to be producing what we call gastrin, which stimulates also the production of what we call hydrochloric acid. Okay, so now these are some of the super very important cells that we need to pay much attention to. During the study of the phases of the gastric secretion, we are going to be talking about all of these cells. That's why we just wanted to have an overview before we go into the detail of these phases. Okay, so now in the next video, we are now going to be starting with the first phase of gastric secretion, which is the cephalic phase. Okay, so now at TUMNAD, I have talked a lot of things, and if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and then subscribe. TUMNAD as always.